Welcome, everyone. Listen, if you're here, I know you're a focused learner, hungry for the real truth about our past. Today, we're doing an explainer that's going to completely flip the script on how we look at the linear timeline of human history. For decades, right, the story of human progress has been taught as this super neat, orderly progression, A to B to C. But the ground beneath that theory, it is shifting fast. The absolute latest archaeological data is telling us a wildly different, and honestly, far more fascinating story.
It's kind of the ultimate question, isn't it? What actually makes us civilized? We've all been handed the exact same textbook narrative. Civilization sparked neatly in Mesopotamia, triggered by the invention of farming. You know the drill. Farming allowed us to settle down, then we invented writing, and finally we built temples. It's a very clean, logical story. The only problem, as we're going to see in this explainer, the physical evidence from all around the globe completely contradicts it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap to today's journey. We'll start by defining human civilization. Then we'll look at monuments built before agriculture. From there, we'll explore the first urban centers, track some independent global origins, and wrap up by totally rethinking our history.
Section 1. Defining human civilization, setting the ground rules.
So before we break the rules, we have to know what they are. According to Steve Blaha's working definition, to officially be declared civilized by traditional standards, a society needs several thousand people sharing a common culture and geographic locale. Crucially, they also need to leave behind significant monumental buildings and show some form of political structure, even if it's not some massive unified empire. This has basically been the academic checklist forever. Now, what's really interesting is how academics have historically layered technology right on top of that checklist. Take the Magrathia taxonomy from the Comparative Civilizations Review, for example. Under this framework, civilizations are rigidly categorized by their communication tech and power institutions. Civilization 1 requires ideographic writing and an imperial government. Civilization 2 demands alphabetic writing. Essentially, the traditional academic framework says you need writing and centralized power to validate that your ancient society was complex. Just keep this rigid framework in mind because we are literally about to blow it right out of the water.
Section 2. Monuments before agriculture, breaking the timeline.
Okay, so the old paradigm insisted that humans absolutely had to invent agriculture first in order to build cities, and then eventually they'd get around to building religious temples. It was a strict sequence, but if we map out the physical evidence coming out of Turkey, it entirely reverses this. It turns out hunter-gatherers actually built massive religious temples first, which anchored them to a sedentary life, and that sedentary life then necessitated the invention of agriculture just to feed all the builders. I really want to let that number sink in. 12,000 years. We are talking about the pre-pottery Neolithic period, spanning from roughly 12,000 to 10,200 years ago. At a site called Karahan Tepe in southeastern Turkey, human beings were out there doing things that our history textbooks say shouldn't have been possible for another 6 millennia. It's absolutely wild. At Karahan Tepe, excavators recently uncovered this stone T-pillar featuring a brilliantly carved human face alongside artifacts that archaeologists are now saying represent the world's oldest three-dimensional narrative. Try to visualize that for a second. We're talking about rich, symbolic 3D narrative storytelling existing thousands of years before the very first ideographic writing was ever scratched into a piece of clay. It is profound evidence of incredibly complex symbolic thought from people who, technically, were still just hunting and gathering. And this brilliantly illustrates the real shock to the system. Look at the spread here. The monumental stone circles of Göbekli Tepe were built around 9500 BCE. Yet, we don't see Sumerian cuneiform, the supposed absolute dawn of Civilization 1, until 3100 BCE. To put that into perspective, the ancient Anatolian builders are further in time from the Sumerians than the Sumerians are from us today. The cradle of civilization is much, much older than anyone thought. Section 3. The first urban centers, suburban sprawl and beer tablets. So if the timeline itself is broken, what about the development of our cities? Well, at Tel Brak in Syria, up in northern Mesopotamia, excavations are revealing that ancient people were already engaging in early forms of urban expansion. It's basically what we can only describe as suburban sprawl. Ancient squatters and settlers were building out the first suburban communities way, way before the famous southern city-states ever claimed the monopoly on urban life. Meanwhile, let's jump over to Southeast Europe. The Vinca culture thrived there between 5400 and 4500 BC. These people lived in massive, highly complex tell settlements like Vinca Belliberto. They were crafting this really distinctive dark burnished pottery, and incredibly, they provide some of the earliest evidence of extractive metallurgy in all of Europe. So you have to ask yourself, does this fit our rigid textbook definition of civilization? I mean, they had the massive numbers, the centralized locales, and the advanced technology. And they were developing it all entirely on their own terms.
And then, of course, we have the Sumerians down in Iraq. Around 3100 BC, they finally invent early writing, officially hitting that Civilization 1 milestone. But what I find so brilliantly funny about this is what they actually used this groundbreaking, world-changing technology for. As the artifacts clearly show, one of their very first administrative priorities was recording the allocation of malt, barley, and beer. That's right, when humanity finally learns to write, our very first thought is making sure we keep an accurate track of the bar tab.
Section 4. Independent Global Origins, Rising in Isolation. Let's move across the globe and see how this builds. See, civilization wasn't just some infection that spread outward from a single point in the Middle East. Look at this massive number, 8,000 years. While sites like Liangzhu give us solid evidence of 5,000 years of Chinese civilization, the Jiahu ruins of the Peiligang culture push that timeline back a staggering 3,000 extra years. Since excavations kicked off in 1983 in Hainan, the Jiahu ruins have revealed an absolute wealth of world-first relics. We are talking about 8,000-year-old wooden coffins, some of the very earliest known pottery on Earth, and these incredibly intricate bone and horn tools. These people were operating at an incredibly high level of societal complexity, and they were doing it completely unaware of whatever was happening over in Turkey or Mesopotamia. And then we cross the ocean to the Americas to find the absolute anomaly that is the Norte Chico civilization in Peru. You've got to watch this contradiction unfold. They built 30 major population centers complete with monumental architecture and complex irrigation, all managed by a centralized theocratic government. Yet they were a pre-ceramic culture. That means no pottery, no art. And get this, they fueled this massive sprawling society almost entirely on an anchovy-based diet. But the most shocking part, excavations show literally zero evidence of defensive construction or warfare. A peaceful, highly complex, fish-eating civilization that defies every single rule in the academic playbook. No way, right? Section 5, Rethinking Our History, the new picture of humanity. I want you to step back for a second and just look at all these data points we've covered today, from Turkey to China to Peru. Let me give you one last massive myth-busting fact to really cement this new perspective. The Chichen Bajo complex in Peru, which is this structure made of rock and adobe spanning up to 39 feet across, has been carbon dated to roughly 3,500 BCE. Do you realize what that means? It means monumental architecture in the Americas actually predates the Great Pyramid of Giza. Human brilliance wasn't just sitting around waiting for a signal from the Near East. It was already wide awake and building massive structures across the entire planet. The source material covering those Jiahu ruins we talked about earlier perfectly describes their site with this quote: "The first threshold in humanity's transition from ignorance to civilization." It's a great quote. But the absolute truth we've uncovered today is that there wasn't just one single threshold. Whether it was hunter-gatherers carving 3D stories into Anatolian limestone, or South Americans building peaceful theocracies fueled by anchovies, humanity crossed this threshold in a dozen different ways, in a dozen completely different places. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely thrilling thought. If everything we just learned is true, if hunter-gatherers were out there building massive monuments before they ever planted a single seed, and if complex cities could arise without the need for warfare or even basic pottery, what other rigid rules of history are just sitting there waiting to be broken? The ground beneath our past is shifting, my friends, and the next great archaeological discovery could rewrite the textbooks all over again. Keep learning, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next explainer.